Let's see what Paladipika has to say about using Jupiter's transits to predict the time of death. Udaya dragana natasya tatarandradipasya cha randradrekana pashyapi bhamsha kone gurau mriti. This first statement, Udayat dragana natasya, means the Lord of the rising drakana. What's a drakana? These are the thirds of a sign. The first 10 degrees of the sign belongs to the sign itself or the ruler of that sign, and then the other 2 segments belong to the trines from it. If you want to review that in more detail, please look back to chapter 3 of Paladipika in my live streams, which are on the channel page. The next statement here, Tatarandradipasya cha, it just means also the Lord of the 8th house. And then he says, Randra Drekhanapasya api, also the Lord of the 8th house is Drekana. And api means this is not optional. These 3 have to be affected at the same time for you to really be sure that there's a significant event like death. And in this 4th statement, Bhamsha Kone Gura, he's talking about a Kona, of course, by transit, and by Bhamsha, which means by a degree. So he's talking about it coming close to 120 degrees, not just necessarily being in a trinal sign. What happens then? You get Mriti, death. So the translation would be, death occurs when Jupiter transits trine to the Lord of the rising Dracan, the 8th Lord, and the Lord of the 8th house's Dracan. In other words, it's not just if Jupiter transits the Lord of the rising Dracan that you should predict death. It should also transit the Lord of the 8th house and even also the Lord of the 8th house's Dracan. As for the logic behind this technique, maybe it is that Jupiter increases these things, and so Jupiter's trinal transit of these 3 death indicators increases the death indicator. Let's have a look at the chart of somebody we know who's deceased and see if it works out. Why don't we try out Bruce Lee? Let's figure out these 3 key points. How do we know the Lord of the rising Dracan? Well, look for the degree of the ascendant. His ascendant is 6 degrees Sagittarius. 6 degrees is less than 10, right? That means it's in the first third of the sign. So it's in the first Dracan of Sagittarius, which means that it's in the Sagittarian Dracan, which means Jupiter, the Lord of Sagittarius, is the Lord of the rising Dracan. So we could just note that. All the house cusps will be based on the ascendant. So if the ascendant is in the first Dracan, then all the house cusps will be in the first Dracan of their sign. Then just go to the 8th sign, which for Bruce Lee is Cancer, the 8th sign from the ascendant, and take the first Dracan, which would also be Cancer. Therefore, the moon, the Lord of Cancer, is the Lord of the 8th house's Dracan. Make a note of that. And then the easiest step in this whole thing is just to look at the Lord of the 8th house, which is also the moon. So Bruce Lee's chart has a little bit more prone to death, you might say. Because out of 3 things that have to be aspected by Jupiter, it's been reduced to only 2. It's just Jupiter and the moon now. Now let's see if Jupiter was actually involved at the time of his death. He died on July 20th, 1973, and here is the transit chart to his chart. Jupiter is in the first third of Aquarius, which means it does not trine itself or the moon. So it seems like this technique has failed, but actually Jupiter is exactly square to both natal Jupiter and natal moon. So this technique wasn't exactly to the trine, but it is doing something. However, for Bruce Lee's death transit, the real indicator is this Mars right here, which is in Mritubhaga, the degree of death, while it's making a very, very significant transit. So what's the significant transit? Well, from here on the Mritubhaga of Aries, Mars is aspecting 2 key points. First of all, it's aspecting Ketu, transiting Ketu, which is transiting exactly on his 8th house cusp. And second of all, it's aspecting this natal cluster in his 12th house, Scorpio. What is there in his 12th house, Scorpio? The 8th Lord, 12th Lord, the 7th Lord, another indicator of death, and the 6th Lord. So really, the Mars transit is the real eye catcher to indicate a death event. And then the Jupiter square to those important points that we read about in this technique is a supporting evidence. Let's have a look at one more chart. Here is Richard Pryor. So let's figure out his key 3 points. His ascendant is at 24 degrees of Pisces. So that is more than 20 degrees. So it's in the 3rd Dracana, the third. The 3rd Dracana of Pisces is the 3rd trine from Pisces. So in other words, it's Scorpio. So the ruler of that Dracana is Mars. Now that we know that we're dealing with the 3rd Dracanas for the house cusps, just go to Libra, the 8th sign in Pryor's chart, and ask what is the 3rd Dracana in Libra. It's going to be the 3rd trine from Libra, which is Gemini. So therefore the ruler of the 8th house Dracana is the ruler of Gemini, which is Mercury. And then finally, the easy thing, just get the 8th Lord. Pryor's 8th house is Libra, so the Lord is Venus. Now, Richard Pryor died on December 10th, 2005. Is Jupiter trining these 3 key points, Mars, Venus, and Mercury? Indeed it is, actually. Is there any other support? Well, Saturn is exactly square to that transiting Jupiter, which is affecting those 3 key points as well. It's also exactly square to itself natally, and Jupiter natally, and Mars by transit, which means that Mars reciprocally is exactly square with it and exactly opposite to that Jupiter, which was affecting those 3 key points for him. So this is a very good illustration of this technique. This is just one way to predict death to Jupiter transits. You need to have supporting evidence from at least one other one. And in this chapter of Paladipika, he's going to go through a whole bunch of other ones. So please make sure you're subscribed and that you have the notifications turned on. You pay attention to the notifications and come check out the videos that will be coming out soon. Don't forget, I've got some other video series going on right now that are very interesting. Astrology versus science, as well as Jupiter and all the houses. Please enjoy all those videos. Thank you so much.